Sally is perhaps the most unwelcome guest among the current Atlantic storms. Hurricane Paulette is over Bermuda, and Renee, Teddy, and now Vicky are spinning over open waters.
Primal, destructive, growing more and more dangerous every year.
A hurricane represents a massive force of Mother Nature. You sure need to respect them.
Sally became a hurricane this morning, packing 90-mile-an-hour winds.
Off the coast of Florida, an unexpected pile of rocks and a ship's bell. What do they reveal about how monster storms shape America's past?
It's a hurricane victim, and hurricanes are some of those violent forces that happen on planet Earth.
Had this hurricane not happened, America might have looked very, very different.
And how does a sunken mass of subway cars give us hope of resisting future hurricanes?
Epic things had happened on the seabed. Subway cars were rotated, shifted, moved, or completely obliterated.
Dealing with hurricanes is very emotionally taxing, but it's part of the price of living on this area of the Gulf Coast.
Every year, hurricanes batter America's eastern and southern coastlines. They've been a menace for centuries. They destroy, disrupt, and some even change the course of history.
There's a lot of shipwrecks in our bay, but we always hope to find the earliest ones. So the Pensacola Shipwreck Survey was the brainchild of Dr. Roger Smith.
And Roger was a legendary maritime archaeologist, especially here in Florida.
He knew that Pensacola Bay had such high potential because very early in the 16th century there were Spanish explorers poking around this area looking for bays and harbors.
Myself and Jim Spyrick and Chuck Hewson.
We always hoped that we would find some of the evidence of these early Spanish explorers. Sometimes we would dive on these sites that the fishermen or the shrimpers would show us, and it was junk. Car bodies, or piles of tires, or one time we found a pizza oven. But there was always that hope the next dive was going to turn up something amazing. So we kept on at it. I never dreamed, that we would be finding something so important historically and archaeologically.
In the fall of 1992,
we had been surveying at this particular place and had found some targets. And the first dive, I believe, was a piece of shrimp boat gear. The second dive, I think, was a car body, a Volkswagen Beetle or something. And so the third dive, it was mine and Chuck's turn, and so we geared up and jumped in the water, and Jim was on the boat, a safety. The water is very dark there. You could not see even 12 feet. I was on my knees holding the anchor at the bottom of the buoy line. Chuck swam out and did a circle, didn't find anything, and out another few feet. By that time was out of my range of vision. A few minutes later, he comes swimming back up the line, and he looks at me and he goes like this. So his eyes are real big. I knew he had found something interesting. So I had followed him back down the line to this big pile of rocks. Here in Pensacola, we don't have naturally occurring rocks like that. The top layer was oyster shell. Generations and generations of oysters had lived and died on this pile of rocks. We started moving this top layer of rocks. The rock went deeper and deeper and deeper, of these varying sizes of these kind of roundish river cobbles.
Now we got really excited because these kinds of rocks were used as ballast in these old vessels to keep them stable as they were sailing across the ocean.
Once we finally got down to the very bottom layer of rock, underneath that was this beautiful carved wood.
And that's when we knew for sure we had a shipwreck.
I remember getting on the phone with Roger and saying, Roger, you need to come and see this. We had no idea the age of it, but it looked like it was a historic shipwreck. So we shifted our focus from survey of Pensacola Bay to focusing on the site that had the potential to be something very old and very important. One of the local businesses in Pensacola donated a small wooden barge to us that we could anchor up on site and leave there and use as our excavation platform. But it was leaky, and occasionally it would sink. So not a whole lot of work was going to happen until we could move the barge.
So Jim, what's the plan for today?
We had found wooden structure, and it wasn't just an isolated like little piece or splinter of wood. This was major internal structural framing. We had no idea really the true age of it at that point, and so that's when we decided, well, let's move over a little ways, and we happened to come down right where that heel of the mast is attached very securely into the hull of the ship. Finding this wooden structure was huge for us, and that mast step was just classic 16th century.
The 1500s is when European exploration in North America really kicks off, before the Pilgrims or the English settlements at Jamestown. This ship dates to that era. But where does it come from? And who was on board?
We started using the induction dredge, which is like an underwater vacuum cleaner, to go down in layers and very carefully recover whatever artifacts we found. We began to see really amazingly preserved artifacts. Things like pieces of rope, hemp line, even leather shoe soles.
I had a phone call where I was invited to come to Florida to serve as the conservator for this ship to take care of the artifacts. We were trying to find as many clues as we could to help identify the origin of the vessel. Each day, something different would show up in remarkable condition. We found some real plain, unglazed pottery. It was just coarse earthenware. We actually call them olive jars. When we found olive jars, it was one of the first big clues that we're working with a Spanish shipwreck, because these big jars, we know the Spanish carried olives in them.
Spain establishes its first permanent settlement in Florida at St. Augustine in 1565. But the artifacts coming from the ship point to an earlier date, the 1550s. Could these be the remains of one of the earliest European colonizers on the American mainland?
On one side of the ship, as we were excavating, we ran out of hull structure. There was nothing else there. And the framing and the ship's timbers were shattered.
We found hundreds and hundreds of the small spikes that were used to attach the planking to the hull frame. And so they were scattered on the wreck site, and almost all of them are bent. Many of them are even broken. It was obvious that the ship pounded up and down, and eventually it split open and broke apart like that.
Whatever had caused this ship to wreck was a violent, catastrophic occurrence.
Like a hurricane.
There was only one colonizing expedition from the 1550s that we could think of that had wrecked on the Gulf Coast.
So all of these clues that we began to put together began to make us think, maybe this is Luna.
According to historical records, a Spanish explorer, Don Tristan de Luna Arellano, founds a settlement somewhere on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico in 1559. It lasts just 2 years before vanishing without a trace.
The records for the Spanish colonial effort in the New World are vast and voluminous and well preserved in general. I was always interested in archaeology and the thrill of exploration and discovery, but the documents provide so much more rich detail and made it much more personal. The Luna expedition was the most well-financed and certainly the most ambitious attempt to establish a Spanish foothold in Florida.
The search for the Luna land site has been ongoing in Pensacola for years and years. We always joked that we might find a plank that said Luna was here, carved into it.
Luna arrived in 1559 with a fleet, and they unloaded 1,500 people, 500 soldiers and 1,000 additional colonists. He had no way to know that a hurricane was coming. The wreck showed clear evidence of being driven ashore, and that actually corresponds quite well with a letter that was written by Tristan de Luna to the King of Spain, in which he describes that a storm hit about 5 weeks in. The hurricane arrived at night, and then for the next 24 hours, the winds came from all directions. And he said that the ships were broken free from their anchors, driven ashore, and broken open and destroyed.
But if this was a ship from the Luna expedition, it raises a whole new question. We know that Luna lost 7 ships in that storm. Where were the rest of them?
We got a very large grant from the state of Florida to continue the survey, to try to find the other ships and confirm we had located Luna's fleet. So we purchased a really state-of-the-art magnetometer.
I started here right after Hurricane Ivan. That was my first hurricane at University of West Florida. Before that, I'd been doing remote sensing surveys, and that's some of the expertise that I brought to the program. Magnetometers can sense ferrous metals, which is typically iron in a shipwreck, and that's how we find these wrecks.
It seemed logical. If the first ship was in this area, let's continue to look around that ship with this new magnetometer.
That's where we got lucky. With a magnetometer, you never really know what you have until you put divers in the water. It's actually diving on these remote sensing anomalies that we find to find out what they are. And when we began finding the hollow jar fragments, the lead sheathing on the hulls, that's when the light bulbs began going off.
We found enough little pieces of olive jar that we were convinced on day 2 that it was a Luna ship associated with the first one.
One ship in the bay might be explained away as something random, but 2 ships near each other, that was an astoundingly important discovery. It confirmed, in my mind, that we absolutely, positively did have the Luna fleet here. It meant that not only did we have a number more wrecks to find, but that we also had that settlement site and that it had to be close.
For nearly 10 years, the team searches for the location of Tristan de Luna's lost settlement and finds nothing.
We had no archaeological evidence whatsoever to pin down where the settlement was. In the fall of 2015, a former student reported that he had found some Spanish artifacts in a newly cleared house lot and wanted us to take a look. Thought they might be 16th century. My first reaction was, okay, great. You know, we have a lot of people reporting a lot of things, but something in the back of my mind, I think, you know, tickled my interest because of the fact that it was on a particular lot in a particular neighborhood, right where we thought Luna might be located. It turns out that it was identical to the kinds of olive jar that had already been found on the shipwrecks.
The team investigating the 16th century Spanish shipwrecks hopes the pottery shards found on shore will finally lead them to the lost settlement of Tristan da Luna.
We called on current students and former students, everybody in the faculty and the staff, anybody who we could get out there. In 5 days of intense field work, we found literally hundreds of pieces of olive jar.
I got real excited personally, thinking maybe this is it. One of the very first major expeditions to settle what is now the United States.
Once the neighbors started to realize the importance of the site, they began to call themselves America's first neighborhood. We did basically a year's worth of full-fledged shovel testing and dug more than 900 shovel tests across more than 50 acres.
All the evidence indicates that this settlement was the largest ever attempted in 16th century Florida.
We are essentially digging up a very short-lived city.
The scale of the settlement confirms that the Spanish crown equips the expedition with everything it needs to survive in the New World. But a major hurricane is a force few Europeans have ever experienced. When it arrives, the colony is helpless.
I've lived in Florida since 2001, and I've been through quite a few hurricanes, so I've seen enough to know that this storm must have been absolutely devastating. We do know from the documents that the hurricane caught them in the midst of construction, and as a result, they had not actually started to use the warehouse for storing food. And so the hurricane wiped out not just the fleet, but the food that they had stored on it. It took 24 hours for the storm to pass completely through. Luna doubtless saw that his fleet was devastated, and there was nothing left but hulks of broken ships and masts and lots of supplies, barrels and boxes, crates. The Luna expedition could have changed the course of history in this continent. But overnight, the settlers were transformed from part of the most ambitious and well-financed colonial expeditions that Spain ever mounted to North America into starving refugees.
Some of the settlers decided to throw in the towel and go home. Some, including Luna, struggled on for nearly 2 years, but ultimately the site was abandoned.
Had this hurricane not happened, America might have looked very, very different today. It's entirely possible, even likely, that because the Spanish would have had a really solid foothold in southeastern North America, a full generation before the English settlers arrived at Jamestown, North America might simply have been Spanish North America.
Instead, the British and French come to dominate most of the continent. The Spanish settlements in Florida, like St. Augustine, eventually fall under British control. St. Augustine remains the oldest continuously inhabited city in the United States and a victim of countless hurricanes since its founding.
You've had ships coming and going to St. Augustine for over 450 years now. At the same time, it's always had a treacherous inlet. There's a lot of job security if you're an underwater archaeologist in St. Augustine because there have been so many shipwrecks over the years. We know there's a lot out there, but finding them is what's tricky. We have an operation that can actually go out and find shipwrecks, at least until hurricane season cuts our dive season short.
It was at the end of the field season, so we were all pretty tired. And we had this book of the various targets that we had, and we said, let's go to this one. It's got a magnetic signature that looks interesting.
We are blessed with really poor diving conditions here in St. Augustine. It's pretty black down there. We do our best to pinpoint the exact location, and then we will probe. I cleared off an area, and then I began to feel with my fingers. I could feel lumpy, bumpy, rock-like things. I immediately knew they weren't any kind of natural stone, but what we call concretion, so iron objects that were encrusted with rust. I felt a wooden plank. At this point, my heart is bump, 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 beating down there alone in the dark. I really knew there's really nothing else that could be. It just had to be a shipwreck.
We got Chuck back on the boat, and he's like, we have ourselves a wreck.
The game is afoot now. We have something.
I'm like, that's really good news. It was actually the perfect way to end a field season.
There is an old joke in archaeology, it's almost a truism, that you make your big discovery on the last day.
We were done for the summer.
September brings the peak of Florida's hurricane season, making it impossible to excavate. But for archaeologists, unsettled weather can be both a curse and a blessing.
After a period of storm activity, we had an opportunity to go out and take a look at the site. So what we would call a monitoring dive.
It was a beautiful morning. I was on the first dive team, and it's absolutely beautiful conditions, crystal clear. And I look forward, and it's just like this blue gloom, but a really rich, beautiful blue. And so we're going along, and I'm looking at this blue gloom, and then I see this something looming out of the blue gloom. And I'm like, that's a cannon. And then I look again, and right next to the cannon is a bell. And I can't believe it. It's like, it's just not computing. I mean, that's a cannon, and that's a bell. And I'm like, look at this. So we swam around, and it was almost like a whole different wreck, you know?
They came up after a relatively short amount of time, and Sam pulled his regulator out of his mask, and he said, there's 10 feet of visibility. Well, that instantly got everyone's attention on the boat. We had not yet seen any of the shipwreck. We had been down there without able to, just doing archaeology by braille. And then the next sentence he says, oh, and there's 5 cannon and the ship's bell just sitting there on the surface. So that, our first reaction is like, are you joking?
And I'm like, nah, man, I'm just kidding.
And I could see in his eyes, I'm like, you're not joking. He's like, no, I'm not joking. There's cannons and a bell right down here.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best dive I've ever done.
A ship's bell, that's the holy grail for a diving archaeologist. That could give the name of the ship and the year it was launched.
So we had this event, we invited all sorts of people, nice nibbles and drinks, and our conservator was starting to clean off the bell, and the idea was we're going to have this wonderful event where we reveal the name of the wreck. And she cleaned the bell, and there was no name at all. It was a completely blank bell.
This ship's secrets weren't just going to fall into our laps. We needed to get more information. Archaeology is just like a crime scene investigation. We are trying to reconstruct a scenario, an event from the past. In our case, it's a really cold case. It goes back hundreds of years.
One of the things that was obvious from the beginning, the arrangement of the material and the guns in particular on the seabed was not what I would call normal.
Cannons, if they're in place as weapons, you might expect to find cannons kind of evenly placed, pointing away from the shipwreck. The bell is usually at the belfry, that's at a certain part of the ship, maybe cookware, things like that, where the galley or the kitchen of the ship would be. We had definitely a different scenario.
It was clear that something was going on. One of the objects that I noticed was this long, strange, cylindrical object, and it was all lead, completely and utterly lead.
It had an attached length of plumbing or piping to it. This was a deck pump. When you operated the pump handle, you were pumping up nice, clean seawater to swab the decks, to fight a fire. So a deck pump was a way to get seawater on board the vessel for a variety of purposes.
We brought this up and we had it in the lab, and one of the team, very keen eyes, noticed that there were hack marks on the lead.
We had more than one segment of plumbing that had been cut clean through. And then we realized what had happened.
Someone had taken an axe and hacked it out of the ship.
This is an expensive piece of equipment. Why would you purposely disable it? The answer that makes sense to us is that this was a frenzied attempt, a desperate attempt to remove this pump from the hull of the ship where it would have been mounted. It seems pretty clear to us that that is an attempt to lighten the ship. And that makes sense if a ship has run aground and you have to try to save the ship by jettisoning all the heavy cargo. These artifacts are telling the story of the desperate attempt by the captain, the crew, and the passengers to try to save the ship. If you can just get the ship to float up off the sandbar, then you can get it ashore and you saved the vessel. We had found the bell, the cannons, the deck pump, but we had only ever found that one wooden plank. There was no hull, no remains of the ship structure itself. Was it possible that the ship had gotten away?
Hoping to solve the mystery of the ship's fate, the investigation takes a closer look at the metal artifacts found off the coast of St. Augustine.
When you have an iron object that is immersed in seawater for centuries, it undergoes a number of chemical changes. That rust turns into an incrustation. It turns into a coating. It's thick and lumpy and bumpy, and shells get stuck to it, and often you'll have more than one artifact near each other, and they all just rust together into what may just be an amorphous blob.
Once we started examining the concretions, x-raying the concretions, and finding the smaller objects within the concretions, that is when the full story of what actually happened came out. What X-rays can do, if you really amp up the power, it can actually see through the calcium carbonate.
We found a lot of small items, a lot of personal items, a lot of cookware, a lot of plates, a lot of spoons, shoe buckles, coins. So we really are getting a picture that a lot of the things that people were bringing with them ended up on the seafloor.
When we found the Queen Anne's pistol, expensive small items that you absolutely would not throw overboard under any circumstance, that told us the story that they were so stuck on the bar they never got off.
It seems pretty conclusive that this ship could not be saved, and we have the burial ground of this vessel and all of the items that were on board.
What archaeologists really want to do is we want to tell the story. Where was it from? When did it wreck? Why did it wreck? So our story evolved from very small clues.
There was a lot of stuff. We found the base of a wine glass that we knew dated to sometime in the 1700s. We found a pewter spoon, the same thing. Everything we found, it seemed to push the date to the second half and even the later 1700s. So as we narrow that time range down, there was one event in particular that looked promising.
In December 1782, the American Revolution is entering its final phase. The 13 colonies are a dangerous place for those still loyal to the crown. So in dozens of ships, they flee to Florida, which remains loyal to King George III. They hope to find refuge in St. Augustine, but not all of them reach safety.
This could be a candidate, one of these ships. Everything seemed to be pointing into this direction. We had debates about what artifacts we might actually find that would really be definitive. And then it happened. We found the artifact. It was a single button, a small pewter button. It had lettering on it that we could see after cleaning, the letters RP with a crown above, and that told us immediately that we had loyalists on board, because that RP button stands for Royal Provincials. That's a unit in the British Army. It's made up of Americans who are loyal to King George. It is poignant to read some of the letters, to read some of the accounts that were written back and forth about this particular event. That's a really, really important part of the process. Elizabeth Lichtenstein Johnson was a Georgia loyalist. She had evacuated and had ended up in St. Augustine, and so she was an eyewitness to these shipwrecks. 16 vessels, small vessels, she says, have been lost on and about the bar. So that means they have run aground on the sandbar. These ships were carrying people, but they're also their hopes and dreams for making a new life in this really difficult time in their lives, and they're just strewn on the sandbar. We don't know for sure what caused these ships to wreck, but we know there was a hurricane just 2 months before this fleet came to grief. We don't know exactly what its impact was on Florida, but a hurricane represents a massive force of Mother Nature.
Every time a hurricane came through, the channel would change, the sands would shift.
That shifting sandbar meant that these ships had no idea where the safe channel was.
So it is possible that hurricanes effectively cause these wrecks.
In a very real sense, it is because of hurricanes that this inlet was so dangerous. These storms throughout history have changed history. And what a hurricane does below the water can be just as dramatic as what it does on shore.
Millions of people on or near the American coast live under the threat of hurricanes. But of all the dangers these monster storms bring, the greatest comes from storm surges, the huge volume of ocean water pushed ashore by the storm. The surges can cause devastating, even deadly flooding.
Obviously, all of us across the country are concerned about the potential impact of Hurricane Sandy.
We are expecting a very large storm with impacts over a very large area.
When we saw that Sandy was coming our way, we dropped everything. I remember calling up the director of marine operations and saying, I need to get on that boat. I'm a coastal geologist, and my primary mission is to try and anticipate how and where storm surge will hit populated areas. People think the sky is where to look for clues to the damage a hurricane is going to do. But for me, the answers are underwater. We really need to understand what's going on in the water and at the seabed if we're going to try to understand how storm surge plays out.
Yeah, looks good.
When they tell you to evacuate, you need to evacuate.
While everyone else was preparing to leave, we were heading 16 miles offshore towards the approaching storm. We needed to seize that moment. You try to capture a picture of the seabed right before the storm and see how that storm would evolve and change. That would give us an incredible picture of how the seafloor, the ocean, and the sky interact, something that has very rarely, if ever, been done. And the best place to do it is at Redbird Reef.
This is no ordinary patch on the sea floor. It's the strangest of artificial reefs.
There are hundreds upon hundreds of New York City subway cars on the seafloor.
2.5 meters. We're closing in on it.
For me, the Redbird Reef site has become a great natural laboratory for us to better understand hurricanes and their impacts on the coastline.
I need a little bit more. I'm getting tugged. That's it right there. Yep, coming right up on the corner.
It really makes for an amazing seascape. Rows upon rows of subway cars in different orientations and arrangements. I often chuckle to my archaeologist friends and say, how would you interpret this hundreds of years from now? What kind of bizarre sort of battle took place here?
We've been studying Redbird Reef for over a decade now.
The missing element was we needed a storm. What Sandy meant for us is it gave us for the first time an opportunity to see how a single storm event could change the seabed.
Let's see how she's looking here. Good.
I wanted 4 days out at that site. We could squeeze 1 day to get everything done. That meant we needed to map the site, we needed to deploy our instruments, and then we needed to get the heck out of there before Sandy came through.
We're looking for tropical storm force winds along the coast beginning tonight.
One of the last things we did was deploy an instrument frame to the seafloor that was going to sit out there during the storm and measure the waves and currents. As we were leaving, I had this thought, will we ever see that instrument package again?
The waves that were created from this storm covered over an area of 1.4 million square miles. So this was a massive storm for the Atlantic Basin. It's just incomprehensible to think about the billions and billions of dollars of damage that was wrought by this storm. Once Sandy had passed, we went back out to the site to recover our instrumentation. We just didn't know what to expect when we got out there and whether or not we'd have any equipment left to recover.
We start hauling up the lines, and as part of the rope was coming up, I saw this tangle of metal wrapped in the line, and my heart sank.
I turned and looked at Art, and he just, this exasperated sigh of, oh my goodness, there's nothing left. It turns out that that was a piece of one of the subway cars, possibly a door frame or a window frame.
The storm had torn it free and tangled it up amongst our line as the waves and the currents were sloshing back and forth. So we kept hauling up, pulling up, and then suddenly through the water, I see the frame of our instrument package, and when it burst through the surface, it was just a real moment of elation. And my final thought was, I hope we hit record. As we start looking back through the records, where our eyes are just going bug-eyed, right there at the Redbird Reef site, we measured 2.5-story high waves with a period of 16 seconds. Every 16 seconds, another one of these monster mammoth waves is coming through, generating 3-knot currents at the seafloor in 100 feet of water.
The currents that were being generated by that storm was staggering to us.
We knew in that moment that our gambit had paid off. But to truly gauge the power of the currents, we needed to measure the storm's impact right at the seabed. That meant we needed to map the site to see how much damage was done. One of the most valuable assets that we have in our research arsenal is our small, unpersoned submarine, and it's fully autonomous, meaning we have to plan its missions, and then we hit go, and she dives below the surface, off on its own to navigate through this mysterious subsea world. We're painting a three-dimensional picture, very high resolution and precision, so we can get every little bump and divot of the seabed. We started going through piece by piece in every portion of the Redbird Reef site and looking at the changes before and after Sandy.
Yeah, look at the scour around some of these subway cars.
We could see whole areas where the surface sand was pulled and eroded away. It became very obvious to us that epic things had happened on the seabed, because there were suddenly areas where subway cars were missing, or that were flipped on their sides, or broken apart. There were subway cars that were just rotated, shifted, moved, or completely obliterated.
We're talking about subway cars that weigh on the order of 75,000 pounds, just eviscerated by the currents that were occurring down there, which really shows you the power and the amount of energy that's being imparted on the seafloor.
The largest and perhaps most impressive structure in the artificial reef system is the former ex-USS Arthur Radford. It was a Navy destroyer, and it's the largest artificial reef object north of Florida, anywhere on the East Coast. More than 500 feet long. But when we went out and then surveyed over the Radford, that's when it just clearly showed us that this storm took things to a whole nother level. It's in deeper water depths, and it's a much larger structure. We knew from before the storm that the Radford was in 3 parts. When we got out there and mapped it after Sandy, it was just jaw-dropping to realize that entire center section was picked up and rotated more than 30 degrees. We're talking about an enormous Navy destroyer, moved more than 200 feet in 120 feet of water. It really shocked me. It really surprised me to see how much change there was to the seabed. I've never seen it over that sort of scale and magnitude. We now know how much of an effect a storm has on the sea floor, but that interaction goes both ways. Water movement is affected by the shape of the seafloor as the storm moves towards the land. And those initial conditions are what determine how storm surge behaves and ultimately where and how it hits. That's crucial information. You know, in hindsight, we could have lost everything, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment. But if we didn't risk that loss, we wouldn't have the goldmine of information about how the seafloor changes during a storm. We have the technology now to monitor these changes as each storm passes. We can feed that into our storm surge models and predict where and how the next storm surge is going to occur. There are going to be more storms, and there are going to be more intense storms, and we need every bit of information we can to help combat storm surge losses. Here, for the first time in the history of hurricanes, we might finally have a weapon that helps us fight the worst of what those hurricanes are throwing at us.
With up to $1 billion of treasure on the line, this is going to be a fight all the way to the finish.
So who does it belong to? We found it. It's ours, says Florida salvage company Odyssey Marine. The Spanish government says, we don't think so.
Lawyer James Gould is representing Spain in its legal battle with Odyssey Marine.
Sunken ships are like time capsules. I've specialized in protecting them from treasure hunting companies. Spain's history has been taken, and we've got to get it back. But that doesn't mean that a U.S. judge has to agree with me. I've got to prove it.
As far as I'm concerned, it didn't belong to Spain. We were conducting salvage operations in international waters.
At stake, not just $500 million, but a crucial question: who owns history? The answer lies in a wreck over half a mile under the waves.
What for you is the difference between treasure hunting and marine archaeology?
Well, there's the thing. How long have we got?
We were out in the Atlantic Ocean. The North Atlantic has a tendency to be on the bad side. Storms come across the ocean on a regular basis. It was a difficult area to work in, but I have to say we'd gotten quite good at that. We had made modifications to the ship over the years to help it operate better under those conditions. And so we just went out and started mowing the lawn, is what we call it, covering it with sonar, looking for more wrecks. All of these searches are hours and hours and hours of very tedious monitoring. But you can't let your concentration stray. And we came across quite a number of shipwrecks in that area. You know, a lot of these shipwrecks were unidentified. So we just kept doing that, mowing the lawn, finding more wrecks. And then all of a sudden, with the sonar, we came across little hard dots, which represents a debris field.
It wouldn't look like a shipwreck. Unless you knew what you were looking for, you wouldn't give it a second glance. So we're going to put an ROV in the water and we're going to go down and have a look at this.
We're talking 1,100 meters to the seabed. That's twice the height of the Empire State Building. After 150, 200 meters, the daylight disappears. It's complete darkness.
We drove towards the area with the ROV so that we'd try to get a big picture of what it looked like.
And suddenly, Zeus turns on its lights and boom. There are these rocks on the seabed, and the ROV crawls in.
When you looked out the gloom and you saw down these molehills,
the ROV operator, he screamed, "It's coins!" And the room just exploded because everybody else had been kind of afraid to say it.
Look at that lot. Yes! Wow! Yeah! Thousands.
You know, there were just coins everywhere. It was unbelievable. Greg and I had known each other for quite a number of years. He would come out on the ship with us quite often whenever he could get away from the office for any period of time. He loves the adventure.
Archaeologists actually run our operations, but we're also in a commercial business. We sell the duplicate coins. We'll make those available to the public so they can own them.
If you've got 50,000 coins, which are all the same, put some in a museum and sell the rest to pay for the science and perhaps create a bit of a profit.
I think we had investigated 6 targets that day. And so when you've suddenly had success, it's great joy. This was the last shipwreck of the day.
This site's a monster. It's 282 meters long, 100 meters wide.
It represented the size of a football pitch. It was unbelievable. And we just kept finding bundle after bundle after bundle of coins.
And at this time, we know we're clicking, wow, this is a lot of money here. This is hundreds of millions. But where's the rest of the wreck? Where is it? Why have we got all these mounds of coins and not any structure?
The shipwreck is something that has a keel, it has hull. You can make out different clusters of material or pottery or cannon, but this was just scattered as far as the eye could see. There is no part of the structure of a ship, it's gone. And it's confusing, right?
So then, that's when the underwater detectives bit comes in and we need to map it and see what it is.
And Zeus started to fly across the seabed, not touch anything, just take photographs.
Click, 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 taking pictures.
It would oftentimes take 2 days, 3 days, till we collected enough images to stitch them together.
I think, was it 14,000 images for this photo mosaic? I thought, wow, what have we got here? I've got this perfect map. It was unbelievable to see these mounds.
This is a massive concentration of clumps of coins with copper ingots, bars of tin, and then some small finds. It's a strange mess. A random collection of artifacts, as if you'd thrown something out of a 100-story window.
You know, initially, we can't even say it's from one ship because it was scattered so far and wide.
But nobody has seen anything like this before. How does a ship break up in such a way to form in this manner, and what happened to the rest of it?
Until we get more artifacts up and identify it, all we know right now is that we found a shipwreck with a bunch of coins on it. And that's not a bad thing, no matter where they came from.
I got this call out of the blue.
Hello, Jim Delgado.
It was Greg.
Oh, hi, Greg. How are you?
I don't know why Greg called. It surprised me. I met Greg Stem at a conference in the UK, talking about shipwrecks on the high seas and a new type of business model with selling the goods of the past. But I didn't know the man, and I'd never worked with him. So I didn't have much of a sense of Greg. He said he was at a site. The most amazing thing was that there was no shipwreck, he said. It was as if somebody had just discarded and thrown over chests of coins. Had I ever seen a site like that? I said, well, no, I never had. It seemed rather strange. I said, are they patterned or positioned in a way that suggests that maybe a ship fell over and capsized, or is there more of a wreck buried? He said, no, it's just this money. And I said, well, that's interesting. I've never seen anything like that. And when I hung up, I wondered, what was that all about? And that's the last I thought of it for a while.
Right away, we knew that there's a lot of value in these coins, so we decided on a methodology for an excavation in the site.
We designed special tools to be able to protect these very fragile clumps of coins or artifacts that we had anticipated recovering. There are just tons of coins coming up, coated in mud, and the archaeologists would have to spend time sorting them out of the mud.
This stuff's really worse than baby poo on a blanket.
And then recording all the details of each coin and giving it an artifact number and logging it. You know, then it would go into a bucket where we put a preserving fluid to try to protect the coins as much as we could till we could get them ashore. And Greg was out there every time the vehicle came up and, you know, looking at what we had brought up.
There's a lot of coins down there.
What was very interesting about the coin collection is the damage on these coins is obviously done through some traumatic force, such as a huge explosion. So I was trying to separate the bent coins so that I could take them to an expert on explosions and work out how did this coin get bent like that.
We didn't know at the time, but ultimately we recovered 17 tons of silver coins. And we did it in roughly 3 weeks. It's an unbelievable recovery.
Odyssey decide to fly the coins and artifacts to the United States and file a claim on the treasure.
We quickly filled up the cargo spaces of the plane, and we still had buckets, and so they went into seats and got individually strapped into the seats.
This is so surreal.
We had not seen anything to identify the wreck,
And so we kept referring to it as the Black Swan, the code name that we gave to it.
At the time, Greg was reading Nassim Taleb's book on the Black Swan. A Black Swan event is something that is completely unexpected and utterly transforms the world we live in. So everything sort of clicked into place.
But deep-sea explorers out of Tampa have struck gold for real. Divers for a company called Odyssey Marine Explorations found a ship that sank in the Atlantic.
Del último tesoro rescatado del fondo del mar por la empresa norteamericana Odyssey.
17 tons of silver and gold coins, up to $500 million.
I think it was in 2007 that I read an article in the newspaper that mentioned those words, treasure hunters. And that immediately made something to me. I mean, I was very attracted to mysteries. I'm a journalist. I used to be a reporter in El País, the biggest newspaper in Spain. I published a story about the Black Swan. I call it Pieces of Fate in honor to the Treasure Island, one of my favorite books. And in fact, it was true. There were almost 500,000 pieces of fate. 3 hours later, we received a call from the Ministry of Culture because they are really angry. They told us, we know that Odyssey has been looking for a treasure in an area very close to Spanish waters, and we're just trying to prove if that treasure belongs to Spain.
It is very difficult to express what we felt because we are against treasure hunters companies because they just work for private benefit.
I've been fighting against all the treasure hunters companies every day of my life, and it's completely forbidden to sell any object. That's what the Spanish law says.
There was no time to be angry. I mean, we have to work to show everyone that the treasure belongs to Spain. And so, yes, the first reaction was to go to court. So we called our ambassador in Washington, and the embassy helped us to contact James Gould.
I got a call from the Spanish embassy within an hour of the newspapers having shown up. And so the first thing I did was get out the magnifying glass and look at every copy of this photo that I could to see what the coins were. I noticed that they had been changed to obscure the image of whatever king it was. And so I couldn't tell whether they were Spanish, British, French, or whatever. But it turned out that Odyssey had filed a lawsuit a month before, an advert at the back of a newspaper saying that they had discovered an unidentified vessel. That started a clock running under which if no one came into court and disputed that Odyssey was entitled to all of that material, then they could go to court and say, we're the owners. So we couldn't sit on our hands, we had to move fast.
I got a call. Greg was in town. Would you like to meet up? And I thought, this is going to be a painful meeting. You know, I'd read the headlines. They were being trashed in the national newspapers. So I met up with Greg. He was in very high spirits. He was delighted with the publicity, and Odyssey thought that they had a very strong position legally that they'd be able to retain ownership of this material.
Spanish laws say that you cannot earn money selling the cultural heritage. But Greg was someone that believes everything is possible if you fight for that.
We know it's a ship. We know it's, well, maybe. But as opposed to, well, we've got a lot of coins that we found in the bottom of the ocean. You know, it's amazing. Sometimes people just dump things off of ships to prevent the ships from sinking. It's happened.
They're lightning it, if you will.
Exactly.
And Greg knew very well that if he win this battle, if he could prove there was no shipwreck, that the treasure had just been discarded, then Spain would not have a claim and it would all go to Odyssey.
As the deadline approaches, James Gould contests Odyssey's claim on the treasure in the Florida courts.
Now, what Spain has to do is not only intervene, it has to prove there's a shipwreck and that that shipwreck belongs to them, and that the coins were the king's money and part of the sovereign property of Spain.
By the end of that day, I dashed off a letter to Odyssey's lawyer saying, on behalf of Spain, please inform us of what it is. And next Monday evening, I was on a plane to Madrid.
We knew we have to be very quick to identify the shipwreck. There was no time to be angry or to cry. We have to defend the heritage.
I've got to prove it was a Spanish shipwreck. So the first question is, what had happened in history at that spot? But Odyssey wouldn't reveal the exact location where they'd been working. So on that first trip to Madrid, I sat down with the Spanish Navy to ask what they could find about the movements of Odyssey's ships, because there are ways. There are GPS signal tracking devices that every ship is required to have. And so sure enough, there was a record for Odyssey's ship, but once they got 20 or 30 miles from Gibraltar, their signal went dark. So then I thought, well, something's going on here. But there were a few blips that had still shown up, 5 or 6 of them, and there was a cluster of them south of Portugal. So then I thought, okay, something had to happen around here. So then we started looking in the history books, and in a very short time, I found that there had been an absolutely pivotal event in Spanish and world history in October 5, 1804, what was called the Battle of St. Mary.
At the time, Spain is still a global, powerful empire, but its influence is waning.
Spain had made a deal that if they paid Napoleon a vast amount of money each month, he wouldn't invade Spain. He'd focus on invading Great Britain. So it was a form of protection money.
And that's what sets up this entire tale, because the King of Spain needs more money. Where does he get that money? He gets it from his Latin American colonies, and specifically orders his warships to load silver from the mints down in South America. And so they cross the Atlantic. But what they haven't counted on is the fact that there are spies. And in the United Kingdom, the decision is made to stop those ships. A small British force of ships intercepts the Spanish vessels in what basically amounted to high seas hijacking.
A British ship called Amphion cuts across the line of the Spanish ships behind a Spanish vessel called Mercedes. And the British Navy opens fire.
The single shot from Amphion goes right through the hull of Mercedes and lodges in the magazine where all the gunpowder is stored. In that moment, that powder goes off in a massive explosion that tears the ship apart. Mercedes cracks open like an egg and spills her contents into the sea, and rains debris all over the ocean, as well as onto the nearby ships. Stunning doesn't even really begin to convey the horror of that moment. It is a war grave with 250 dead, including Spanish sailors, Marines, and the wives and the children of Spanish officers. That loss of that ship not only saw 250 lives taken, it saw Britain and it saw Spain return to a state of war, leading to a period of tremendous civil unrest, the weakening of the Spanish Empire. In just a year, the great naval battle of Trafalgar is going to see the French and Spanish fleets literally destroyed by Nelson. All of this hinges on what happens on that spot of water back on October 5th, 1804.
Navy records gave us the positions, which tells us that's where the Mercedes sank. Then I turned and compared it to what we had learned from those blips, and sure enough, bullseye. The exact location where they had been taking the coins. Well, it had to be the Mercedes, but that's not going to be enough to prove in court what actually was there. I needed to see what was on the bottom at the site, what Odyssey's own records revealed.
Only Odyssey's own data, its photography and the location of the site could confirm for sure that there's a shipwreck down there, and if it's a naval vessel. The trouble was, they weren't rushing to hand it over, and their ships were in a port that Spain couldn't get to.
Gibraltar is a place in dispute. It's a rock that is in the land of Spain, but it belongs to the United Kingdom. So the Guardia Civil couldn't go into Gibraltar to check the Odyssey Explorer. They had to wait till they get out of the port.
The Spanish made it very clear that should we leave that harbor, they would capture us.
In 6-foot swells, a Spanish government gunboat intercepts the salvage vessel, the Odyssey Explorer.
Captain of the Odyssey, we're going to approach the vessel.
Any interference with our transit in international waters will be a clear violation.
We're going to approach your vessel and go aboard. Get ready, please, get ready.
The Odyssey Explorer had been in Gibraltar, I don't know, for months. And each day was costing them a fortune in running costs for the ship. So they had to eventually leave port, even though they knew they'd be captured.
Sure enough, both ships were seized, took them into Spanish ports, took a lot of things off of the ship. We had, of course, already stripped the ship of anything from the Black Swan. We did not have any of the data drives or anything that had the data in it on the ship. But they still took all the data drives out of every computer and things like that. So they were not very nice about it.
Without Odyssey's data and photography, it would be virtually impossible for us to prove that this was definitely the Mercedes. So now the legal team had to up the game to discover exactly where Odyssey had been looking.
The one thing I'd learned from my brief interactions with Greg was that he didn't do anything without a lot of research. He didn't go unless he knew what he was looking for and where he might likely find it.
Not everybody can read 16th century Spanish. Not everybody knows where to look for those documents. Over a period of more than 35 years, I have worked for many different institutions as a researcher. In 2005, I was contacted by someone from Odyssey, and they were interested in knowing where a number of ships were approaching the Bay of Cadiz. And at one point, we had altogether 50 different ships for their database for that one area. And then they became interested in one particular ship, and all the most detailed information that one could possibly find was of interest to them. When the story broke, I felt absolutely horrified because my first job is I'm a historian. I am not interested in the treasure. I immediately contacted the people in Odyssey by email. And they got back and they said, oh, just relax, no problem. we have everything under control. So I said, well, it's not under control here. And every time you turn the radio on, every time you turn Spanish news on at night, every time you buy a newspaper, it was just on and on and on and on and on and on. I mean, I was accused of being a spy. And they said, oh, we can't tell you anything. We're not about to say what the ship is that we found or where exactly we are. But if you want, we'll give you a hint. And they said, it's something to do with the make of a car. Well, of course, I knew that they had found the Mercedes.
Victoria Staples' statement was very useful because it confirmed that Odyssey had set about this with a deliberate intention of locating the Mercedes. Meanwhile, Greg Stem is issuing sworn statements under oath that they have no evidence that would confirm what ship it was.
It was very hard to believe that they were all the time denying it was La Mercedes. It was really strange for us, something incredible to believe.
So I went back and asked the court to consider doing something about this. And sure enough, an order comes from the judge that Odyssey has been disingenuous and utterly without merit. And Odyssey, after fighting it and fighting it and fighting it, had to turn over the photo mosaic and give me access to their DVDs of the seabed and their photographs. And so there was a very nice moment when finally we could see the site. So now we needed to show that right there on the seabed was a shipwreck, something Odyssey had denied all along.
We were in Houston at a meeting, and when the meeting was done, Jim, in his quiet way, said, "Got a second? I want to ask you a question."
I had these images, some of which I could understand, and he could look at and instantly starts pointing out everything that I had been puzzled by.
This was a very competently done job, which appeared to me to be nothing more than a map for recovering the coins. And I'm not seeing a wooden hull, but I wouldn't after a few hundred years. You could see this was a chunk of a section of hull, in one case, with a cannon tangled in it, meaning that was where a gun port had been. A section of hardware from the rudder that steered the ship. A chest of belongings, including candlesticks, silver platters, things of that sort.
So then we start taking little Post-it markers and pasting them all over the photo mosaic to keep track of them.
And so as I looked at it, I said, this is a shipwreck site. It's clearly a shipwreck site. Look at this. There's a donut of debris, thinner in the middle and very compact around the sides. I said, that's when something explodes.
We could see that there was a shipwreck, but was it the Mercedes?
It was in the right place from approximately that time period, based on the type of ship, the type of fittings, and the guns. It felt good. It felt like the right answer. But then again, shipwreck stories almost always surprise you.
I got used to going through hundreds of hours of these DVDs of the running footage of their ROV as it went back and forth over the seabed. Hundreds of hours of waiting for something to come into sight and then doing a screen grab. And all of a sudden there comes into view a long, elegant, fluted cannon, and it's got very ornate handles that look like dolphins or some kind of fancy dragon. And I go, oh, what? Those are medieval cannons, 2 centuries out of sync with everything else we're seeing. What's going on here?
Were we wrong about it being Mercedes? It felt like we were back to square one.
It was incredibly frustrating.
Obviously, it was problematic. What was I going to do? So I go back to Madrid to start going through the Spanish museums of medieval cannon with Elisa, looking for matches of this. We're coming close, but not quite. And then, wait a minute. On the Mercedes manifest, there's a specific record that the ship was carrying 2 canones bronze inutiles, useless, obsolete bronze cannons. It's a smoking gun that this is the Mercedes. How could it be anything other than that?
We organized a press conference at the Ministry of Culture. We were all very excited, I must admit. We were all very excited. We had very great news to give.
It was the kind of thing I'd never been through before, where you've got press photographers rolling around on the floor in front of you and so on. Well, the mystery is over. The coins and other artifacts that Odyssey took from the site are documented to have been on the Mercedes. We went public, and the world headlines were, "The mystery is over." We came flat out and said, it's the Mercedes.
Whilst we were on the ship, for me, all the clues started to point towards, this is pretty much the Mercedes.
Right from the start?
Yeah, for me anyway, as an archaeologist looking at it, yeah. It was fairly obvious that they were Spanish cannon. Obviously, there's coins saying 1804, and the coins were bent because it blew up. That's pointing towards, it's the Mercedes. What else could it be?
Eventually, even Odyssey begin to acknowledge that it might be the Mercedes. But their lawyers are not finished yet.
One day, they said to me that they were looking for the descendants of the merchants that put all the gold in the cargo of La Mercedes.
There are 811,000 coins on the Mercedes, of which around 74%, 3/4, belong to private individuals. If you find a merchant vessel, whatever is on it, and you claim it, if you can't find the owner, everything belongs to you.
After all this, it might just come down to finders, keepers, losers, weepers.
At times, what it felt like is you'd win some ground, but at every step of the way, a constant pushback.
It takes a lot of work to come in and prove it. Years of litigation. How can a U.S. court say, no, finders, keepers, never mind Spanish history? But that doesn't mean that a U.S. judge has to agree with me.
Greg knew very well that if he win this battle, he would change the story of archaeological treasures in the deep ocean.
What would happen on the final day? And then the decision of the senior judge in Tampa came in by email. The ineffable truth of this case is that the Mercedes is a natural and legal patrimony of Spain. We won. Well, then I called Elisa immediately. And then there were some yells and shouts. Yep.
It was a victory. Yes, it was a great victory. Yes.
my strongest feeling was, good Lord, that's fantastic. One man is not the owner of our common heritage. Every one of us are the owners of the historical heritage.
The judge said that the treasure should go back to Spain, yeah?
As the judge said at the end of this process, there had been a continuous core campaign of bad faith, deception, and deflection. The one good thing that one can say here is it had a positive outcome, and the lesson is there to stand.
Just to have the court turn against us and to lose a battle that we thought we would surely win, it was a devastating impact to the company.
I thought it was unfair and unjust, and I genuinely feel sorry for Odyssey and the way they were treated.
This decision was crucial for their business. So Odyssey couldn't just give up. They had to appeal the court's decision, and they were going to do as much as they could to keep the treasure.
The deep-sea treasure hunting company Odyssey says it will appeal a ruling this week by a Florida judge. The judge ordered it to hand over to Spain $500,000 worth of gold and silver coins.
So the day came when they had to turn over the coins and other objects that they had in the U.S. The Spanish Air Force had agreed to send 2 Hercules military cargo planes. The coins were put on the aircraft. So as we packed up at MacDill Air Force Base and the ramp of the plane comes up, I've still got this worry about, well, what happens if the Supreme Court decides there should be a stay of execution? There came a point just as we were leaving U.S. airspace and I could get through and I start yelling, "Are we okay? Are we okay? Are we okay?"
3231, thank you. Report speed to Hong Kong approach on 119 at 80 bye-bye. 191.
By the time we got to Newfoundland, I'm yelling over this terrific din of the propellers and the vibration in this plane. Are we clear? Is the coast clear? And then I hear, "You're okay, you're okay." And that was that. And then 2 planes which had taken separate routes arranged to land, meet and land wingtip to wingtip. And then immediately the Guardia Civil took security control of everything.
The day that the coins came back to the airport of Madrid, it was a fantastic day. The Guardia Civil accompanied all the coins in several trucks with some helicopters, and it was really spectacular.
That was big news. So for me, once again, the whole story sort of comes up again.
It was a very special moment, and it's something so unusual. I mean, it's we were waiting for 5 years.
I was part of the motorcade to take it down to downtown Madrid to a secure facility. Let's remember that at the end of this case, our objective was to get all of those buckets back to Spain. It took all of this time and all of this money and all of this effort. It was a great relief. By then, I was in a daze.
Two years later, Odyssey is fined $1 million for, in the words of the judge, bad faith and abusive litigation. As one chapter in the story of the Mercedes closes, another is starting.
We have won the legal battle. Now we are obliged to win the scientific battle. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the first day, we put the ROV in the water. And it began to descend until 1 kilometer, 140 meters. And it was going down, 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 in the very middle of the wreck. It was fantastic. We discovered several iron cannons and bronze cannons, 2 culverins, the concentration of silver objects. And we have discovered part of a fork with the initials of the captain of the ship. The captain was Don Jose J. Goicoa. When you think that that fork was in the hands of Don Jose Goicoa, we say, good Lord, this is the very, very proof that we are in the same ship of the Archive of Seville. No doubt this is the Mercedes.
La Mercedes was a tragedy. That's why it was decided to install a commemorative plaque to the people that died at that explosion.
And the wreck site itself had meaning for descendants of those who had died on that ship. It doesn't matter how far back it goes, families remember these events because suddenly a ship is sunk and nobody comes home. It's a story of officers standing on a deck on a nearby ship watching in horror as their wives and their children disintegrated. To British sailors standing there in shock as a simple shot from Amphion sets off the magazine and Mercedes explodes with such violence, and of everything that played out after that, that profoundly changed the course of history for Spain and potentially for all of Europe. And that is the story of Nuestra Señora de las Mercedes. That's what it's all about. Not coins.
City-state like no other, feared the world over.
A rich, powerful republic, making vast amounts of money, protected by a massive fleet of the world's fastest warships.
Venice would be nothing without its ships, but their secrets have been lost for centuries. What can 3 discoveries reveal about how Venice becomes a Renaissance superpower?
This could give us a clue into how the Venetians ruled for almost 500 years.
And why it finally falls into ruin.
There have been extended excavations and they found thousands of bodies.
In a very real sense, the history of Venice lies underwater. We just have to find it.
A city of high culture, magnificent architecture, stunning natural beauty. Made possible by a past steeped in conquest.
At its height 700 years ago, Venice controlled an area spanning 1,000 miles, and its influence stretched across 3 continents. It was a maritime empire of unequaled power and the wealthiest city in Western Europe.
The key to Venice is its watercraft. And while many people know of the famous gondolas, the true Venetian vessel is the galley. These ships dominate the Mediterranean for centuries and are key to Venice becoming a naval power, an economic power, and a political power.
And the seat of this power is the Arsenale, once the biggest industrial facility in the West. Hidden behind high walls, thousands work to build the best warships the world has ever seen.
But the master shipbuilders kept their designs to themselves, handing them down from father to son by word of mouth only. So we have no blueprints or plans for any galleys, and we've never been able to find any evidence of one.
Any archaeologist dreams of discovering a Venetian medieval galley. I've been living and working in Venice for 25 years. It's a place that never ceases to amaze me.
For his entire career, maritime archaeologist Stefano Medas has been searching for evidence of Venice's naval power. He's focused his search in the waters of the lagoon that surrounds the city.
The difficulty in excavating Venice's past is that it sits in a lagoon 200 square miles in size, and that's 3 times the area of Washington, D.C.
Trying to find a ship in these waters is like looking for a needle in a haystack. Actually, it's worse than that. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack underwater with a bucket over your head.
The city sits on 118 small islands connected by bridges and canals. From above, it looks beautiful, but drain the canals and then the lagoon, and you start to understand why nobody, after 700 years, has been able to find any shipwrecks of any significance. Today, over 80% of the lagoon is thick mud. Just about 11% is water. So, even if you were lucky enough to find anything, it would most likely be trapped under the mud. And to dredge the lagoon would take 1,000 years.
Despite the challenges, Stefano is convinced his quest for evidence of an ancient warship is worth continuing.
We know from historical sources, old maps, that something important was there.
In 1997, a team of divers makes a tantalizing discovery. A piece of wood.
It might not sound much, but for archaeologists, it's a breakthrough. A piece of wood could mean a ship.
It was an extraordinary discovery that could give us a lot of information. When you're lucky enough to find a piece of wood, the first thing to do is to try and find out how old it is. So, it's sent to the lab for radiocarbon analysis. It was amazing, because we found out that it was from the 14th century.
Wood from the 14th century. For Stefano and the team, it's like finding the Holy Grail. This is from the time when Venice is at the peak of its naval and economic power. You couldn't have found a piece from a better period.
So now Stefano knows there's something worth finding in the mud of the lagoon.
In 2001, Stefano and his team begin their search in the area where the 14th century piece of wood was discovered.
But the problem is that you're in very muddy water where you can see nothing the moment you stir the mud up.
When they do find something, it's something big.
We started seeing this gigantic hull in perfect condition. It was very emotional for the whole team of archaeologists.
To find out if the structure they found could be a long-lost galley, Stefano turns to the one man who can help him, Venetian historian and ship expert Mauro Bondioli.
They called me because I was the only person in the world with the knowledge to study and identify this particular type of wreck. When Stefano called, I immediately said, okay, I'll drop everything and tomorrow morning I will be at the lagoon. I had thought all night about how to identify a galley from other types of ships. I calculated the length and I said, okay, in this particular point, you should be able to find a structure typically found in galleys, which is the mast step.
A mast step is a notch cut into the backbone of a ship, deep down in its hold. That's a key piece of evidence. But good luck trying to find that along the entire length of a ship buried in the mud when you're doing it by feel.
Armed with this potential lead, the team returns to the submerged wreck.
It was a very long operation because they had to dig through all that mud. I waited at least 3 hours for an answer. Finally, an archaeologist came to the surface and said, we've located this structure made this way and that way. And I told them, you found a galley.
It was obviously extraordinary and exciting because we were certain it was the first wreck of a galley ever found in the Mediterranean and beyond.
So this is a very, very important find, and what you want to do is record every single part of that wreck, inch by inch, do a forensic study of it. The problem is, this wreck is completely covered in mud. You can't even see your hand in front of your face underwater.
How will they excavate this medieval fighting galley from the Venice Lagoon?
They're really going to have to come up with a pretty unique solution.
Stefano Medas and his team believe the 14th century galley they found in the Venice Lagoon is so important it needs to be fully excavated.
So they come up with this crazy idea. Why don't we just drain the water away? And the government agrees, even though this is going to cost $1 million.
The strategy: create a coffer dam, a watertight enclosure they can pump dry. To build it, engineers sink 36-foot-long steel girders vertically into the muddy floor of the lagoon. 300 of them.
They have to fit everything together, girder by girder, perfectly. The slightest gap, even a fraction of an inch, can lead this thing to fail, and the water can't be drained. Now comes the real test. It's getting the water out of there. You have to take huge pumps, and they use 5 of them, to remove millions of gallons. And they work around the clock.
While lowering the water, we spent days anxiously watching because the water level was dropping so slowly.
It takes 2 weeks to build the wall, and it takes a full week to get that cofferdam dry.
What begins to emerge is the outline of a sleek, narrow hull. But to examine it in detail, they have to move fast.
There's a problem with draining the water away, because it's the water and mud that protected the site in the first place. And the moment you remove it, it instantly starts to decay. And actually, that can be quite a quick process, particularly when you expose timbers to the air for the first time. So the important thing was to keep it wet, but also to cover it with protective canvas. And they did that each time they were excavating the timbers.
The excavators worked painstakingly for 3 months, little by little exposing the vessel's unique hydrodynamic shape. Finally, the 700-year-old Galley, the pride of the Venetian fighting fleet and the only one in existence today, is visible in all its glory.
È stato sorprendente.
It was amazing to see the beauty of the hull, the internal frames and the benches, seeing it from the stern to the bow, with its sharp lines. It was really emotional, because it was like going back for one moment into a 14th century boatyard.
The team takes measurements. The hull is 120 feet long and just 15 feet wide. For the first time, they can confirm the number and position of oarsmen powering the vessel.
Now, using all the new data from the excavation, we can bring this lost Venetian galley to life. When you see this extraordinary design slicing through the water, you really get a sense of how these warships made Venice a naval superpower. The engine of this machine? Muscle power. 140 oarsmen rowing together. More rowers equals more power. Uniquely, they set 3 abreast in places, propelling the hydrodynamic hull through the water at an astonishing 6 miles an hour, making this the fastest ship on the seas at the time. And because of this speed and power, a galley could outmaneuver its slower opponents. That's naval superiority.
When a fleet of galleys appeared, with so many oars rowing with an incredible harmonious rhythm, like the wings of a bird, it must have looked fantastic. Really incredible to people who had never seen things like this before.
The crew can even harness the power of a 65-foot-long sail to carry them effortlessly forward when winds are favorable.
Before this galley was excavated, we had no idea how they were made. We had to guess at the design of these vessels. Now we know, from the design of the hull to the power of the oarsmen, these ships were simply years ahead of their time.
They were very maneuverable, sleek, fast war machines.
When the archaeologists are done, they face 2 choices: to raise, recover, and chemically treat it to preserve it at a cost of millions, or put it back in its time capsule. They let the water reclaim the Coffer Dam and bury the ship once again to preserve it. "700 years ago, ports across the Venetian Empire would have been filled with hundreds of galleys like the one lying in Venice Lagoon today. Guarding the coast, protecting trade routes, because trade is the beating heart of the Venetian Republic."
If you had visited Venice 700 years ago, you would have found one of the richest markets in the world. Any type of goods could be found in Venice.
And making this trade possible are vast fleets of Venetian merchant ships, sailing to the far reaches of the Mediterranean into Syria.
Historical documents hint that these ships were loaded with riches, filled to the brim with millions of dollars worth of goods. The problem is, there's not many physical examples left in the archaeological record.
So what could a looted wreck discovered off the coast of Croatia reveal about the wealth of ancient Venice?
There was something important, but nobody knew what was actually hiding on the seabed. The second I saw this wreck, I was hooked. Nothing prepared me for its strange attraction.
For 9 years, Irena Radic-Rossi has been diving here, off the coast of Croatia. The reason lies 80 feet below, a shipwreck first discovered and picked over decades ago.
We know for sure that in the early 60s, a fisherman found the shipwreck site. He kept the information for himself for some time, and then somehow other divers came across this find and started to loot it.
Back then, Croatia is part of communist Yugoslavia. And so when they hear about this find and the looting, the government sent out a team to take a look.
Although the wreck has been looted, the government team still finds some important artifacts.
Among the most exciting things they found are objects that have a date on them.
2 cannon were brought up, marked with the initials Z and A. And these initials stand for Zoani Alberghetti. And Zoani Alberghetti was actually a very famous bronze gun maker based in Venice. And that makes us think instantly there's a connection between this ship and Venice. But even more incredibly, there's a date inscribed on the cannons in Roman numerals. And that date is 1582. And that's a time when Venice has established her place as the #1 trading city, the place where anything and everything is bought and sold, all at a great profit for the merchants and government. And so if that ship is from around this crucial period of the 1580s, the question is, what else can the ship tell us?
The guns were an important clue for discovering the story of the shipwreck, but of course they didn't tell everything.
Starting in 2012, Irena and her team begin charting the size and scale of the plundered wreck to see if they can figure out what the ship was and how it ended up here.
So I will be working in D18. So that's the plan for today. Okay, let's go.
But with every dive, they face danger.
It is forbidden to dive without the gloves on the site because it is full of toxic material. There's elementary mercury. We have lead carbonate.
Mercury and lead were used back in the 1500s for decorating furniture and as pigments for painting. If the divers touched the liquid mercury underwater with bare skin, it would cause burns. Above the surface, it can vaporize, and if inhaled, can lead to brain damage, even death. Lead poisoning can damage the kidneys and nervous system.
When they come out of the water, they become dangerous. So we have to be very careful.
When you study a wreck, you need to carefully measure it. So we lay out metal grids that allow us to map everything in its place. It's a very meticulous science. It's CSI underwater.
After hundreds of dives over several years, Irena collects enough data to map the wreck's structure. Putting it all together begins to reveal what sort of ship it is.
If we were to drain the water away, what you would see is that this truly is not only a large ship, but you'd get a sense of the scale of the hold. It could carry up to 800 tons of cargo. Now today, that's about 5,000 barrels of oil. So we're talking about the 16th century equivalent of a modern container ship.
Although much of the cargo has been looted, some remains. What was the ship carrying, and what can that reveal about its mission?
Finding a historic wreck with that much cargo on it, that many riches, is actually very, very rare.
Irena Radish Rossi and her dive team hope the cargo of a 16th century Venetian ship will allow them to unlock its mysteries.
The hope is that we can find out where the ship was going, and crucially, put a name to it.
And a major clue lies in pieces over the seafloor.
The most extraordinary thing they found were window panes, hundreds of them. And they're still bringing them up today.
It was great. Tamar collected some glass down there, and we will see now what is inside. There is a lot of this glass lying everywhere in the surface layer of the site. When it was packed, it was completely transparent. And now, after 4 centuries of lying down on the seabed, the window panes degraded. So this was beautiful glass that was used in nice buildings. In the 16th century, it was quite a luxury product.
To put a name on the wreck, Irena and her team contact the one man who might be able to figure it out. Mauro Bondioli.
And so she asked me to start archive research, not just to identify the wreck, but to reconstruct its whole history.
Mauro gets 2 solid leads: the age of the ship's guns and a list of the artifacts recovered so far. Then he goes looking for more.
The Venetian State Archives is an incredible trove of documents, state papers, correspondence, cargo lists for ships. It's so vast that it has 50 miles of shelves and over 300 rooms. Oftentimes, researchers go there and they will realize they are the first to touch a piece of paper since it was deposited in the archives hundreds of years ago.
Then Mauro discovers a document about 5,000 window panes, so we immediately thought that it must have been our ship.
According to the records, in 1583, a ship leaves Venice loaded with chandeliers, silk, and 5,000 window panes. Its name, the Galleana Grossa.
I discovered that this was a ship that set out from Venice and was destined for Constantinople.
But that makes no sense. Constantinople is the center of Venice's mortal enemy, the Ottomans. Why are they sailing directly into their enemy's backyard? But the story gets even stranger when it's found out who the cargo is meant for. It goes right to the top of the Ottoman Empire.
One of the most interesting things about this wreck is that this document research has confirmed that the cargo was going directly to the Sultan.
The archives reveal that Sultan Murad III is not your typical warrior king. He loves the finer things in life. He has a big, beautiful palace. He also loves women, lots of women. Murad keeps his wives in the harem, a beautiful building decorated with many glass windows. We know that in 1583, the Sultan faces a terrible disaster. A fire burns down his most precious room in the palace, the harem.
The Sultan was very upset about it, so he wanted to reconstruct it as soon as possible. He gave the orders to purchase the material for the reconstruction and ordered 5,000 window panes. And the Senate of Venice decided to load them in Galliana.
Venetian merchants would sell to anyone, even their enemies. And the government would likely turn a blind eye to that. The trade with the Ottomans was filling the coffers. So if this means trading with the enemy, why not?
But the Sultan never got his consignment of glass.
A fraction of the way into its journey, the Galliana Grossa sinks, making it the richest Renaissance wreck in the Mediterranean.
You have to wonder how such a state-of-the-art merchant ship ended up at the bottom of the ocean.
To find out what could have caused the Galliana Grossa cargo ship to sink, the team turns to clues within the archives.
The Venetian archives tell us that the Galliano sails from Venice in late October 1583. That's late in the season, and the ban on sailing in the winter is about to start.
There's a good reason for that ban.
The Adriatic's a dangerous sea at the best of times. It acts like a big funnel, and it channels storms up and along its length, coming in from the mountains. And it makes it treacherous, particularly if you're pushing it into the stormier part of the season.
What happened? Perhaps it took a while to finish the glass and then to load that precious cargo into the ship. If that's the case, it would be a fatal delay.
The Galliana's course would have taken it right through an area nicknamed Little Ocean, renowned for its storms.
What probably happened is that a squall, a storm strikes, and Galliana Rossa, overloaded with all that heavy glass, begins to list, takes on water, and then falls to the bottom of the sea, taking the Sultan's precious cargo with her.
The fate of the Galliana tells a bigger story, and it's really about the demise of Venice as a trading power.
The Galliana sinks at a critical time of change in the Mediterranean.
By the 1580s, you've got the English, you've got the Spanish, building much bigger ships which could survive brutal voyages across the Atlantic, and they begin to take on the trading role that Venice was once so famous for. Venice is teetering on the brink. Her enemies are expanding into her territory.
But the Venetian civilization is brought to its knees, not by guns and swords, but from an invisible, silent enemy that Venice has no defense against. This new deadly force plunges Venetians into a war they have no chance of winning.
For most people, Venice begins and ends with the city and its famous landmarks. But to really know Venice, you have to look in the less glamorous places.
Venetian historian Giovanni Caniato has spent years piecing together the lives of Venetians during the last decades of the Republic.
No one has paid much attention to the island we're headed to, until recently. But I've discovered it hides a disturbing secret. Walking around this island, I discovered a huge building with hundreds and hundreds of inscriptions, drawing traced on the plaster inside the building. Incredible, incredible, fascinating. And the more I looked, the more I found. I wanted to know who wrote these inscriptions, why they did it, and this curiosity made me crazy, and I started looking for documents to understand why certain names were traced on the walls. I had the impression that most of these drawings were strictly related with trade, with goods that were disembarked in this place, and most of them were the initials of a merchant.
Back at the state archives, Giovanni discovers that the mysterious building dates back to 1562.
The archives tell us that this is a warehouse into which merchants store all the goods that are coming by sea. But if that's the case, then you'd expect it to be built in the center of the city or at the port entrance.
Not on some remote island, 2 miles from the city.
When a team of archaeologists starts digging for artifacts in the shadow of the building, the mystery only deepens.
They find skeletons, bones, human remains. So far, they've dug up about 40 skeletons. It takes a long time to record a human skeleton fully, and it can actually be quite an upsetting process, a disturbing process as well. It takes 14 excavators 2 days to work on just one skeleton and record it fully. One of the first things you do with human bone is find out what period it came from. And what's really interesting is they all seem to date from the same period as the building. That means these people died when the building was in use. What was surprising was they were finding that the skeletons weren't whole. They'd been cut in half, legs were removed. And this is quite a macabre discovery.
To figure out if the terrible mutilations were the cause of death, the team carries out a forensic examination.
Looking at the edges of the bones where these bodies had been cut in half, you find that they're brittle, they're fractured, they're jagged. Bone dries out in the soil. It loses collagen, it becomes brittle. And all of these bones have been fractured in a way that showed that this had happened long after death.
There's only one explanation for what they've found. The skeletons must have been dug up and then cut into pieces.
So the question is, then, why dig them up after they'd been buried?
archaeologists believe the 42 skeletons they found are just the tip of the iceberg.
We don't know what lies under the rest of the island, but the amount of skeletons they've found, that we're probably looking at thousands of skeletons on this site. Layer after layer. Essentially a killing field.
Historian Giovanni Caniato believes clues as to what's behind this mass grave and its brutal burial methods lie in the history books.
From the 14th century on, you begin to see accounts of mass death. Thousands are dying, hundreds a day, and bodies are piling up in the streets. And this fills the population with fear, suspicion. What's causing this? And this is death that spares no one, from the poorest to the richest, and the most powerful.
The Venetians don't know what the cause of these terrible outbreaks actually are. But there is one clue. They begin to notice that the ships that are coming in, that often the sailors are getting ill a short time after they dock at the port.
What we now know is that this is the age of the Black Death, the bubonic plague, carried in fleas on rats. And as this plague spreads throughout Europe and kills so many, it will even hit a place like Venice because rats can be found in ships. And it's ironic that for all of the power and the wealth that comes to Venice in the hold of a ship, now comes death, unstoppable death.
Now, for Giovanni, it all comes together. He realizes the merchant's building is much more than a simple warehouse.
Venetians understood that it was a good idea to have a place for people who were suspected to have the plague. And so they created Lazzaretto Nuovo.
Historical records and archaeological findings allow them to rebuild the isolation facility as it was in 1562, revealing the truth about what happened here.
This was an island where all the ships coming into the lagoon would wait for 40 days, 40 in Italian, or quarantine.
This building marks the height of a revolutionary Venetian innovation. It was the world's largest and most sophisticated quarantine building of the 16th century.
It's amazing when you think about it. This is 400 years before germ theory. But here they are figuring out that you need to isolate people and move them away so that they don't spread it. Sound familiar?
For Giovanni and the team of excavators, the mass graves begin to make sense.
So what you see is, with an estimate of over 500 a day dying, this quarantine island now becomes the overflow for the dying and for the dead.
Can you imagine to live in this island with thousands of other people, half of them dying? You couldn't move, you couldn't go out from the building. Armed guards are checking that you don't move, and if you try to run away, you are killed immediately. That was a terrible situation.
And the team realizes even the desecration of the bones serves a chilling purpose.
With hundreds of bodies a day arriving on the island, there just wasn't enough space to bury everyone. So you'd have to cut down into the existing graves there, cutting through bodies, cutting through corpses to create space for new bodies. I mean, this is quite a picture of hell, really, for the people that were working there.
These inscriptions on the wall take on new meaning and poignancy. Whoever wrote these probably didn't realize this would be the last thing they would ever write, and the last trace of them, other than their bones.
But even with the plague island, this unique city-state is brought slowly to its knees.
Nearly a third of the population is gone, practically overnight, and that includes key people. Shipwrights, soldiers, sailors, merchants, all of the people that made Venice great. Venice never recovers her position.
It goes to show just how fragile even great civilizations can be. Their warships allowed them to dominate the seas, giving them control of ports and trade routes. Their merchant vessels sailed from port to port, amassing vast fortunes, making connections around the Mediterranean, all the way to Constantinople. But it's actually those contacts that ended up bringing death to Venice. There was no defense against the plague. All their technology could do nothing about this deadly disease. Essentially, Venice became a victim of its own success.
But Venice adapted, and the Venetians rode out the bubonic plague. Today, their city is one of the most beautiful and most visited in the world. And that speaks to the power of the human spirit. That speaks to resilience. And that speaks to our ability as humans to go through something tough and come out on the other side.